Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Emeka, Keazor, as was said. My presentation today, first of all, really glad to be here. I managed to miss it last year due to unforeseen circumstances, missed the epoch-making Biafran 50th anniversary event last year due to circumstances beyond my control, but really always a pleasure. I'm proud to say I've been involved with the conference now. This is the 4th year. I have, by fire, by fury, by begging, by stealing, by any means necessary, I have always managed to convince my dear sister, Cho, to allow me an opportunity to be here, and I'm really grateful for that. My presentation, to go straight to the point, I don't have that much time, much as I'm contrary to what I think, is on the historiography of Igbo land. The Igbo historiography, essentially, challenges, triumphs, milestones. Simple introduction, historiography really is the study of how history is written, is recorded. There's been that conundrum of whether written history is history, real history, and oral history is not. We will deal with that, but once I can get my PowerPoints to work. Right. So, the vexed question of Igbo historiography. Let's look at the overarching question first of all, within the Nigerian space. I know you might ask a question about 1,000 years ago when we had, there was no Nigeria. But then the very fact is that certain incidents that are important, are relevant to the consideration of how the historiography was created, require me to at least talk about Nigeria for a few seconds and how the external influences on the overarching landscape affected Igbo land. Now, we go back to the pre-colonial. I'm going to divide it into two phases, three phases, the pre-colonial phase, the colonial phase, and the post-colonial era. Now, let's look at the pre-colonial era, essentially before they came, before the colonizers came, in very simple terms. When we lived in our pure state of nature, as I said, how was history recorded? How was history transmitted? How was it delivered? The major form of transmission was oral history, orality, as is known by we history geeks. Essentially, the transfer of information from generation to generation by oral traditions. But then that wasn't the only channel. We also had written histories in some sectors, like in northern Nigeria. I mean, Islam entered into northern Nigeria about 800 AD or so, just before that. And obviously, Islamic traditions introduced writing. And also, as we know, certain parts of Nigeria had script forms going back at least 500 to 600 years. So there was a form of historiography. But then, there were also other accounts in this era because the very first contact we had, for the very first contact we had with Europeans, certainly in Igbo land, was the explorers, the missionaries. By C.J. Anene's accounts, one of the first accounts of European contact with Igbo land was in 1699 when Jean Babot, the French explorer, traveled across what he referred to as the Guinea coast and recorded his account of the people he saw on his travels. But then I need to take a bit of time and discuss this question of orality. For a very long time we were told that oral history was inferior to written history, that oral history was no history. But then the very fact is that this opinion was not challenged for many years until a new epoch, a new phase, when we, nationalist historians, began to develop a contrary narrative spearheaded by the Ibadan school to the effect that, well, hang on a second. We did have a history. And it's quite interesting that the man who actually led this impetus was an Igbo man, Kenneth Dike, who introduced what was known as a multidisciplinary approach, methodology, involving not just the oral, the written, obviously the written historical accounts, but archaeology, oral history, anthropology, an amalgam of various disciplines that actually created a credible and formidable body of history and historiography, nonetheless. The Ibadan school eventually went on to create a new body of knowledge, which, without going into much detail, was the nationalist historiography that influenced the path that many of us have traveled till date. But let's leave that for the meantime. As said, orality, indigenous scripted accounts, Nsibidi script in the Cross River Basin. Now, not enough work has been done on this by Egyptologists, strangely enough, and indeed by our own academics. Yes, sorry, that's just the way it is. But then the very fact remains that the Nsibidi script was certainly a written form, a script form that was actually employed in the recording of events, the recording of history. So the notion that Africa had no history before the Europeans came was certainly a fallacy, because even very, very fact that Nsibidi script existed destroyed that notion. Now, it had its limitation, but the simple fact that Nsibidi was one of the precepts of the Ekwe fraternity, which is obviously a closed group, thus that script form was not available to everyone. Yes, but the very fact that it existed, after all, I mean, how many people could read in England in the 13th century? Yeah, not that many. So clearly that notion of the absence of a written form was a fallacy. But let's move on. There were also, as I said, written accounts by explorers. I mentioned Babel. But then we also had indigenous amateur historians. One of the very first Igbo sons, if we are to accept the notion, which I certainly believe is correct, that Olaudah Equiano was an Igbo son, he wrote an account of life in his homeland before he was taken into slavery, which was a descriptive account of life in what could have been, or which I certainly would like to believe is Igbo land. So one of the first written histories. By the mid-19th century, we had amateur historians, people like another Igbo son, Africanus Horton, James Beale Horton, who certainly could trace his origins to present-day central Igbo land, who wrote about his homeland, not necessarily a specific history of Igbo land, but at least peripheral reference to Igbo land as they were at the time. But then, in the colonial era, because I need to give you a bit of a background as to why I chose the date 1884. By 1884, the Royal Niger Company started to sign treaties with several Igbo communities. Before this time, it had signed treaties going back to 1877 with Onitsha and a few other communities, but by 1884, a new set of treaties were signed, of which had a certain clause. The main body of the treaty had them agreeing to trade exclusively with the Royal Niger Company, and an indenture, an additional document, was added later, essentially ceding their territories to the Royal Niger Company forever, an addendum, not part of the main document. It is interesting that in 1937, the British Parliament, led by the Ormsby Commission, when it decided to stop paying the annual mining licenses to the Royal Niger Company, this also referred to the fact that a lot of those treaties were seen to have been irregularly or fraudulently obtained. I'll leave you to do the math. Anyway, the first indigenous history of the Igbos, the first written history by, a focused history of the Igbos by an Igbo was written by an Igbo son, was written by Israel Elobe Iweka, the very first Igbo civil engineering contractor who built the iconic Iweka Road at Onitsha. His work was rudimentary. I've read it several times. Written in 1924, sponsored, strangely enough, by the great Igbo, partially sponsored by the great Igbo female icon, Umuokwe. Rudimentary effort, clearly he was a man of letters, but clearly not a man of great sophistication, and he required the help of Reverend Ekpunobi, another Obosi son, in editing and compiling it. But it was an epoch-making event. This was the very first dedicated history of the Igbo people in 1924. History had indeed been made by this. Our historiography was developing. But then it doesn't end there. The fact is that in the colonial phase, as Paul had alluded to, and indeed Chimamanda had very, very eloquently articulated, the first studies of the history and anthropology of Igbo land were conducted by European authors, in the colonial era, and the overarching character of these individuals are the anthropologists. Major Leonard, Charles Partridge, Northcote Thomas, who we've heard quite a bit about it. I don't need to talk about him. Amory Talbot, G.T. Baston, whose iconic work among the Igbos contains a lot of the images that people like us have been pillaging for years, and we should. Xavier Lee Ross, M.M. Green, G.I. Jones, C.K. Mick. These are all their works. I don't want to go into, because obviously time is a constraint. These anthropological studies were criticized by one of the greatest Igbo historians, Adiele. And I just need to make sure that I mention that I am a big fan of Adiele Afigbo. I'm actually a student of his. The man for me is a demigod. when his name is called, I bow down. And with good reason. As far as he was concerned, these studies were colored by the motivations of the principles of the authors. Look, let's not wash it in. They didn't even pretend about the fact that these studies were commissioned to enable the colonial authorities determine how to rule their new territory better and extract what they needed from it. Simple. No, you can clap, I don't mind. I won't complain. And look, my attitude to these things, don't hate the player, hate the game. The simple fact, a guy like G.I. Jones, because Notco Thomas who came there doing shakara, I want to do academic. He was recording everything. He recorded dog, recorded cat, recorded sheep. Lugard came in 1913 and was like, what is this nonsense, my friend? I came here for money, get out. And refused to renew his contract. But then, that's why G.I. Jones, when he was sent to Abakaliki, he was like, should I go and do anthropology? They said, my friend, look, can you go and see how we can make these people appoint a warrant chief because we need money to collect tax? So it's very, very simple. The remit of these guys was to do the bidding of the colonial authorities. Naturally, they were paying them. I mean, even I do commission biographies. And even though I try to apply some integrity in the content of what I write, sometimes I have to consider the fact that if I abuse my client, he might not pay me. But let's leave that for now. Afibo described the studies as displaying the man. When I was in the British Library reading this, and when I read this, I exclaimed in a way that only somebody who was socialized in Igbo land can exclaim. And the thing is, they almost thought I was watching a football because I went to Odogu when I heard this. Afibo described the studies as displaying the idiosyncratic waywardness of colonial anthropology, characterized by lack of focus, method, intensity, or concept. Is there anything remaining for the man? Nothing. By 1920, however, the focus, as I said, narrowed to the study of political system, because generally, Notco Thomas and his ilk and Meek and Leonard had been a bit more broad-based in their study. But then, by 1920, the focus was on political systems. As said, political systems to enable them the tools to govern. Now, the high noon concept, as defined by Afibo, was one whereby they left a little parcel of information which was passed down from years, which is that of centralized authority. That's the superiority of centralized authority. They, first of all, categorized us into three cadres. One, the states, organized states, Muslim states up north, which, as far as they were concerned, were the most civilized. Then the non-Muslim states with sovereign authority, central sovereign authority with kings. And then the pagans with no kings. We were in the last category. We, Idoma, and some Bibu, and so on and so forth. That's why we all get on so well. Anyway, later on, this was by 1940, this was now conflated into two categories. The state peoples and the stateless peoples. And obviously, the latter category, where the more inferior, were seen to be the unwashed savages who were so unsophisticated as not to be able to organize themselves and have a sovereign authority. Okay. Then there was a fight back. As I said, as I had alluded to earlier with the overarching, the initial conversation about the nationalist perspective, the response to the imperialistic concept or imperialistic historiography was led by no less a person than Professor Kenneth Dike, an Igbo son. And, I'm going to summarize the thinking. First of all, the thinking that grounded their attitude of the imperialists to our people in general, and then we'll drill down to the Igbo subsequently. Marjorie Perham, the great historian, the great academic who was the Africa expert, her oft-quoted line goes thus: until the penetration of the Europeans, and quite a bit of information there, Africans were without writing and thus without history. We go back to that same concept I talked about, the fact that or written history, that's absolute, either written history or nothing. Anyway, his approach, his response, I have to finish now. His response was very simple. The point is not that Africans have no history, but there is profound ignorance concerning it, and an almost pathological unwillingness to believe the evidence of it when presented. He went on, there is no criterion by which to compare one culture in terms of progress with another, as each is a product of the environment, and must primarily be judged in relation to the community. And in response to the states and stateless theory, he said simply, The Delta and Eastern Nigerian political organizations served well the needs of their days. The notion still widely prevalent that the multiplicity of independent political units was indicative of the non-existence of some form of authority is, to say the least, a superficial view. Beneath the fragmentation of authority lay deep fundamental unities, not only in religious and cultural spheres, but also, as has been indicated, in politics and economics. Now, let me now finish before they drive me from here. The watershed moment for us, because, when we say it, as far as they're concerned, oh, you're the other side, you would say that, wouldn't you? Well, Professor Thurston Shaw, my other oga, after Afibo Nahim, his work at Igbo, I'm sure 90% of us here know, obviously I can't teach you now, I have no more time, which showed that there was a great civilization, that these stateless people could not have produced such incredible work that was at the confluence of technology and high art. Come on, they couldn't have been that savage, could they? And his work was impetus for others like Onwojogo to follow on in that scholarship. Sadly, this was interrupted, as discussed, this was interrupted by the Civil War. That whole incredible train of scholarship and newfound confidence, that journey towards Renaissance was truncated by the process of self-destruction that was the Nigerian Civil War. The University of Nigeria in Nsukka, which was denigrated before 1967, suddenly became the bastion of the Igbo academics from all over Nigeria who came home. It lasted for 3 months before it became, before the Enugu fell to federal troops. In the aftermath of Biafra, a new historiography emerged, the Civil War historiography, characterized, first of all, by varying levels of apocrypha, fallacy, farce, and some nuggets of powerful truth. That's a matter for another time. These are a list of some, after the war, a new whole library of literature emerged on Igbo history. It's like we found out the work that was meant to have been done between 66 and 70 came off. And then a library, I can't go into detail, it's up there, and I'll share the slide with you. But then I want to end, an important milestone in the historiographical journey after the war was the emergence of gender-focused histories on Igbo women. And these women here, these incredible women, were at the forefront. Actually, one of them is here. Stand up, my friend, let's see you. Bless you. The future, let me finish, exactly 30 seconds, the future. Well, we have been talking books. We've been talking, I managed to pull Ujuako into the film category. There's work to be done. The young man over there talked about the fact that we as Igbos were losing our direction. There's work to be done. There are new frontiers. I've done my own. The rest is left to you. Thank you.
Okay. Vivian Ogbonna is next and is going to talk about her work with documenting Biafra stories.
Thank you very much. My Biafran story project started out of curiosity and, as we say in Nigerian parlance, like joke. It was in 2016, and the most recent agitation for Biafra was in full bloom, and many wars were raging on social media. In May of that year, a friend posted a tribute to his mother, who had been an orphan living in one of Biafra's refugee camps, when his father, a Biafran soldier at the time, stopped by one day to inspect supplies at the camp. He had taken an interest in her, which blossomed into marriage. 1 month later, another friend posted pictures of her parents on her Facebook timeline to celebrate their wedding anniversary. They got married at Isialangwa on the 29th of June, 1968, when the war was at its peak. And then 1 month later, somebody posted a birthday congratulatory message on a friend's timeline. This friend used to play in a music group in the late 1960s. And the last line of the message said, "As the war raged, the music played." Prior to this time, I didn't have a lot of interest in the Nigeria-Biafra war. I knew what led to it. I had heard and read about the pogroms, the mass returns back to the eastern homeland, the refugee camps, Kwashoko, the starving children. Everything I read and saw caused me some pain, but afterwards, I would push the thoughts away. But these 3 Facebook posts opened my eyes to the diversity of experiences that characterized people's lives at the time. It also struck me that most of what I read about that war are political and military accounts written by people who played different roles in its unfolding. There were much fewer stories about the ordinary men, women, and children on the streets of Biafra. I decided to look for these people and tell their stories, or even better, have them tell their stories, because accounts of war are often official, and this has often silenced the victims, who I believe make more honest witnesses. So I started to scour the internet in my spare time. I wrote to the International Committee of the Red Cross. They responded in about 48 hours, sending me documents and giving me access to their photo library. Okay. These are some of the photographs. This shows a feeding, a camp at Oboro. These are just random photographs. This is a hospital that was bombed at Itu. This is a sick bay at Nto Edino Udo, somewhere in Akwa Ibom State. This is a feeding center at Umosu. I like this very much because even in the midst of tragedy, you can see a child. This was a church bombed in Onitsha. This was a leper colony at Itu that was bombed also. This is a medical mission by the Lutheran Church from the US. And this is a DC plane carrying 6.5 tons of medicines and vitamins. This was at Santa Isabel. They were loading relief into a plane, and these are medical missions going to Biafra. These are some of civilian children who were taken outside. These are just a few of the photographs. There are hundreds and thousands of photographs in that archives, in their photo library, which they made available to me. I then wrote to the Caritas, both the local and international branches, but their responses were evasive. I kept on, I read articles by local and foreign missionaries and journalists, local and foreign journalists and writers. I wrote to the Spiritans, that is the organization of the Holy Ghost Fathers, who were in charge of the churches in the East at the time. Most of my mails came back unresponded. But the more background information I gathered, the hungrier I became, and the more I wanted to hear from the proverbial horse's mouth. So I changed my tactics. I got a list of Igbo associations around the world, and I sent a standard email to them asking if there were survivors among their members who would like to share their experiences. There was no single response. In fact, many of the mails came back with mailer error messages. At the same time, I was also putting out posts on the Facebook pages of some Igbo associations and related blogs. Still, I got no response. But on November 21st, 2016, one Ben Onwuka responded to one of my posts. It was Providence because he had just arrived Lagos, Abuja from the Netherlands, from Holland where he lives. He was a Biafran soldier. This is his photograph. And we agreed to meet that same evening. So that evening I went to his niece's house and I interviewed him. But as we started to speak, he started to cry. And he asked that I should reschedule the meeting. We didn't speak again until 2 months later, by which time I had found other people and interviewed more people. And this is how my Biafran Story project has been running, from one lead to the other, with the survivors telling their stories in their own words. So this is how he looks today. He's in his middle 70s. This was my second contributor. He was a musician in Biafra. He played in a music group, and they were going from location to location, playing when those locations were not taken over by the Nigerian forces. I also interviewed Professor Ademora Ezigbo. And then this is my friend's parents who got married during the war. This was Mrs. Mbojikwe. She was a nurse, a health officer in refugee camps. She adopted an abandoned child. Then this is Dr. Smart Eze. He was a Biafran soldier. He was wounded in battle. He was in the Ogbunigwe sector, and he was wounded and he got blind. He doesn't see, but he worked with he was evacuated to Austria. He worked with the United Nations, and he became the United Nations ambassador for disabled persons. Okay, so the stories these survivors recount are the collective experiences of a community, the Igbo community. For the Igbos, who form the bulk of the contributors in this project, the Nigeria-Biafra War is a significant part of our history and collective memory. It was an experience that touched every family in Igbo land, some in more ways than others. We cannot undo that war. We must live with it. But in living with it, we must ensure it never happens again. The stories that have been told have the common themes of death, loss, and suffering running through them. But in each one, we see courage, we see hope, we see perseverance, we see selflessness and love shine through. And I use the word see, because to see is to be a witness. We see families who sheltered and fed strangers, even when they had little themselves. We see women who took on strangers' children. We see children who became so immune to horror that after the war, they would play with skulls and bones littered in their school compound. These are some of the stories documented in mybiafranstory.org. That is a website where I document these stories. And as we share these stories, in family circles, in social gatherings, during sober reflections, even in conferences like this, we are passing on our history from one person to the other, from one generation to another, very much like the original African tradition and culture of orality, if I may borrow my sister's words. And I remember when we were growing up, our aunties would sometimes tell us stories when we sit outside in the evenings. But then memory cannot always be trusted. So we cannot depend on the oral method to preserve these stories. And as our world becomes more digital and more people, especially the young, are reading online, the internet is a very good home for our stories, all sorts of stories. It is a powerful place because of its immediacy and reach. After all, it was through that space that I read stories that birthed this project. But the Biafran story has many other tentacles. It affected a lot of lives, including those of people who were not Biafrans, but whose lives and work became entangled with the war and continue to do so. We must also tell their stories, the missionaries, the aid workers, the humanitarian organizations, the diplomats, and all the brave men and women who worked on the Biafran airlift. I'll say that one of them is somebody that was introduced to me through a mutual friend. His name is David Coren. He participated, and he was a former Peace Corps volunteer in Umuahia before the war. And when the war started, he was asked if he could participate in the airlift, and he agreed. He's written an account of of that event in Far Away in the Skies, which is available on Amazon. We must also tell the stories of journalists through whose reporting the world got to know about the carnage going on in Biafra. We must remember the activists and students who went on hunger strikes and staged protests in front of embassies around the world. We must remember those who raised money for Biafra. We must talk about the countries who took Biafran children in and kept them safe. We must talk about individuals and organizations who strive to keep the memory of Biafra alive in one way or the other. One of them is Silas Tiny. He is a Sao Tomean Portuguese, and he's making a film called Equatorial Constellations. And the presentation he sent to me says the film will bring together former child refugees, Sao Tomeans, joint church aid officials, and volunteers who created the largest and riskiest relief effort the world has ever known. He says, The stories of these children are part of the universal memory and remain as living testimonies. Currently, he's looking for any of the airlifted children or any of the children who were airlifted to San Tome because he thinks the project will not be complete without featuring them. There have been many challenges in running this project. The first is funds to travel in and to travel around to speak to survivors. Secondly, and very importantly, is that most of the contributors are in their 60s and 70s, and most of them are not as engaged with technology as younger people. So sometimes emails go unresponded for weeks and months, drafts are not collected on time, so it has made the process quite slow. And I think there's also something, finally, there's also the most important constraint I've had is the reticence shown by some survivors. I think there's something scary about, having a recorder in front of you or hearing your voice captured in it. So sometimes people back out of interviews. I'll be closing now, but before I do, I'd like to say that this is not a political or academic project. All I seek to do is to humanize survivors, eyewitnesses, and ensure that their experiences are not forgotten. The support I have received has been phenomenal. I didn't realize how much this meant. And I would like to thank all those who have been part of this journey, those who have shared their experiences, those who give me leads and suggestions, those who encourage me through mails, phone calls, and those who, especially those who read, because in reading, we learn and we pass on the stories. Thank you. God bless.
Thank you, Vivian. And I'll just quickly add that, incidentally, we have an official from the Gabonese embassy here. And we know Gabon played a huge part in helping Biafra and nursing the malnourished Biafran children to health. So, but you'll be hearing from this space later about our collaboration with the Gabonese embassy. Yeah. So next is Chinedu Brian Ezeike.
Igbo bi Igbo ekene m unu. Alụnụ. Ndị echọrọ m iwe ohere a kenekwa ndị niile chili echichi nọ n'ebe a na ndị okongwu niile. Your Excellency and Mekene. London, hello. So, forgive me if I rush through this. I have been warned many times about timing. So let me just get to it. So recently, we being my wife and I, we started radically Igbofying our household. That's what I call it. Thank you. That was a good start already. So we have 3 boys, and what we did is we seized all their electronic devices, all their toys. So we forced them to understand that for them to get anything from us, they have to speak Igbo. In sentences, not words, not bianya manka, no, in sentences with correct enunciations. And the interesting thing about that is we know everything that we taught them because we have a book, a lesson book. We review it once in a while, and we make them write stuff in there. And my wife and I do too. But once in a while, they go off script. So very recently, one of my oldest son saw something. Now, we all know that if you see a cockroach, a big cockroach, the first thing you do is you grab a slippers. That is the ultimate weapon of disruption. So he saw one, and then he called, "Daddy, Daddy." So I looked, I was like, what's the problem? He said, "Daddy, Daddy, what tell him slippers, what tell him slippers." So the funny thing for me was he's becoming creative with the language now. You know, I always say that you can't really say that you understand Igbo until you know how to be funny in Igbo or to insult somebody in Igbo. So that's when now you're going beyond the basic understanding. So those are the boys. We live in Atlanta, Georgia. Our house is the last house in the woods, so we are infested with big fat cockroaches. Yes, so the slippers comes in handy. And my wife warned me that I'm not gonna have our kids looking all crazy, so this is a more normal picture. So I tell that story to illustrate that the kids are paying attention, and we have to make content available to them. So I always thought that my entry into the Nigerian market would be a big, bold English production. But once I had kids, that all changed. I knew it was time to start producing Igbo content and making them very real and authentic. So right now, we started producing content about 2015. Right now, we have 2 shows that are doing quite well on the Africa Magic Igbo platform. So it airs primarily in Nigeria and 26 African countries. So the first show is called Ebengoli. Ebengoli is a talk show where we discuss controversial issues that affect Ndi Igbo, and we try to have fun doing it. So let's take a look.
Afam Zoro, aka Akpaswag, aka Obelujuku, and every Ebengoli, everyone are kwaku, woo.
Obvious, can mana abe na nke a na-akpọ obele of Adam Zero.
A na-asụzi asụsụ ahụ ma nza ha afụ hey ihe a nne na nna m na-fụrụ n'anya etu a abụkwụ ihe ya eme ntụfu ha wee nwee ike ịmụta mgbaa mgbọrọgwụ n'ime ya.
A na-abụ nwunye m
nwaanyị na-akwa akwa maka na ọkụkọ yi na-akwa n'elu akwa ịkwara akwa dị n'elu akwa nwaanyị nne m akwụkwọ gị kwakasin nọ na gị obodo agbalịkwara.
Yes, all kwakasin. And the second show is called Onyije, the Traveler. So, thank you. Onyije is a travelogue, so we take people through an epic journey of Igbo land as we discover what various towns have to offer. Let's take a look at that.
Onu mana Igbo anyị si na mberede nyere dike, mana ọkwa mberede ka eji ama dike.
Onye a na-afụkwa onye ijeres na-ebute okwute.
Sorry about that, it's kind of stuttering. Let me try that again. I think I computer freeze ago. Let's try it again.
Onu mana Igbo anyị si na mberede nyere dike, mana ọkwa mberede ka eji ama dike.
Onye a na-afụkwa onye ijeres na-ebute okwute.
Alright, so sorry about that, guys. Just give me a second. It is, looks like it's frozen. Let me just go to the clip directly. All right, let's try that the last time here.
Onu mana Igbo anyị si na mberede nyere dike, mana ọkwa mberede ka eji ama dike.
Onye a na-afụkwa onye ijeres na-ebute okwute.
Ụlọ ga-akawa alụ deede onye iji maka na ihe anyị ka ga-eweta karịrị nne dị ọzọ ka ndị kọdịwasị na bọọlụ.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much for that. So that said season 2, but we're actually on season 3 now. So we've been going at it for a while. But with all that comes some pain and some gains. It's come at a real cost. We have sacrificed significant amount of money, time, personal safety, and to a large extent, our sanity to put within this thing. Because on your go business na Igbo manadrizi. Especially, we've been through maybe 56 communities, and we're dealing with the elders, we're dealing with the youth, we're dealing with kings, all kinds of people. But we thank God, that can aganiru. So I just wanted to show you guys a slide. This stats kind of gives you an idea the kind of work we do before we shoot. So we send somebody out to survey the land, make sure everything is going well. So he drives about 3,200 kilometers before we shoot. Walks about 75 hours. Because a lot of those places that you go to, sometimes you park the car and you have to walk sometimes up to 3 hours to get to a waterfall somewhere that nobody even knows where it is. That's why we're onije. We travel. We go where people don't want to go. And then when we shoot, we drive about 3,000 kilometers. We walk about 60 hours, the whole crew. And every day, we shoot about 8 to 12 days. And we're shooting for 15 days. So every single day, we're traveling through a new town all the way through all the Igbo states. So that right there tells you that we are exposed to a lot of different elements. This is one of them. I can't even explain what happened. Car just veered off the road. That's our car right there, in the ditch. I walked away, my wrist might be broken, I don't know. But I'm alive, and my crew is alive. It's not my time yet. It's not my time. Glory be to God. So I've never shown that publicly. It's very hard for me to watch still. When I was going through this session, I looked at it. That happened in 2015, and I've never watched it since then. I just recorded it on my phone and put it away. So yeah, that's that. That's the reality of the kind of work we do. Thank you. So many encouraging things have happened since then. We have an active Facebook page. The Onyeje Facebook page is doing pretty well. Ebengoli as well. People are very vocal as far as their passion and criticism of the kind of work that we're doing. Trust in Igbo now. I got something to say. Akwete, Chimamanda talked about it. So we shot an episode in Akwete showing these ladies still making this clothing and textile in a very traditional fashion. So that is the material I bought the day we shot this in 2015, and that's what I'm wearing right now. I always make a point every Igbo function I go to wear Igbo traditional clothing. And this old man we met in Nengwe, it's a town outside of Enugu. We went there to shoot an episode. He does that by himself in the village. And we were very interested in the work that he does, very encouraging. And so we not only bought the hats, we used this as a gimmick for our other show, Ebengoli. So what we did was just to give the man some business. We bought not just that many, I think it was 20 or 25 hats. So every studio guest that came to Ebengoli got that hat. So in all 13 episodes, you will see our guest with that hat. And we talk about his business as well. But that's not it. My wife and I, we have a fashion accessories company called Jide. We use West African prints and Nigerian elements to make handbags and jewelry. And that's one of our studio guests. This year, we were approved to be at the Essence Festival in New Orleans. And, thank God for that. It's just a small business we started last year, but we've been doing pretty well. So our old papa, his hats are going to be sold in New Orleans this summer.
Wow, that's nice.
And before I get in trouble, let me just say that's my wife there. Oh, yeah. So here's another thing. Many people have been asking us, Onije, you guys go to these different places. How do we go there? There's no infrastructure. There's really no company running programs like that. So we started Onije Tours. Right now, we're talking to some interesting groups, taking people from different places, whether it's US or groups in Nigeria, to these interesting places. And I think Chimamanda talked about that too. Why don't we create a business around these shrines? Well, we're doing it already. So, thank you. We have a lot of work to do. We got children's programming we're working on, animations, feature films, both on the English and the Igbo side, documentaries. A lot of work to do, but we made a point that we're going to start with the Igbo language. We didn't know it would take us 3 years before we ever did an English programming, but we are very proud of that. So I'm about to close. Acknowledgements. You see me here. I'm standing alone, but I have a team behind me. We've put them through a lot. They have suffered just as much as I have suffered. But we've been together since 2015. And, I get very emotional when I look at that because when we pitched our idea to them, they believed in us. And still, till today, they have never left. Through all the sickness, all the accidents, they're still there with us. And really very low pay, but we know what we're doing. And, I'm proud of that group. So that's part of my crew from Onije. Is much bigger than that. There's a couple of our crew. And this is our hosts from Ebengoli, the talk show. And this is the dream team, myself and my business partners, Chijioke Webute, who could not be here. And it will really make me happy if you guys can recognize one of my business partners that came from Nigeria this morning. So these together, three of us, we do all this work, and we're always looking to partner with other people. And just appreciate you guys for supporting our work. In closing, everybody knows that popular song from Christy Esianibokwe. But what I wanted to say was I hope that we understand that we are at a very critical stage in our civilization, in my opinion. There are many families that I've seen that have experienced absolute death of the Igbo language. I'm talking that you come into a family and you see none of their children know how to speak Igbo. To me, that is a cultural tragedy. And to me, it's unacceptable. Many people are content with their kids understanding Igbo. But to me, it's not enough because it's all about transferring the language. For the language to survive, it has to be transferred to the next generation. And you cannot transfer that language if you don't know how to speak it. Thank you very much.